Okay. Could I just ask if you can hear me, please? I can see there are 7 of you in the room. Just let me know in the chat. That's great. Fantastic. Well, I shall start without wasting anyone's time. I am going to share my screen here, and I do now know how to do it properly. All right. You should be seeing a presentation now. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and explain a bit about the PAS 2035 process specifically. That's me. I'm involved in lots of retrofit things. I'm very happy to talk about retrofit to anybody, anytime. In fact, that is what I do for a living. So my contact details are there, and I'll put those back up at the end should you want them. Now, this slide I wasn't going to use in the clinic, but it didn't work earlier. So I think it's worth just explaining who we are and what we do briefly. So the Retrofit Academy is a community interest company. Our mission is all about, helping people to live in warm, healthy homes, and to achieve that through good retrofit, really. Our main work stream is around training retrofit coordinators. So you'll have heard of these people, I'm sure, by now. We came up with that term a decade ago, and we developed a training course and now the nationally recognised qualification that leads to people becoming accredited as them. It's quite an extensive course, 150 hours or so worth of learning. It's aimed at existing built environment professionals in the main. That might range from a sort of a domestic energy assessor to a chartered architect surveyor or a social housing asset manager. We're also the National Centre of Excellence for Retrofit. So some of the things I was talking about earlier in terms of PAS Club and the summits that we organise and so on and so forth, they're all Centre of Excellence activities. This Thursday, we have our own Retrofit for Social Housing Summit, which is free for anyone to attend, actually. And if you just Google that, it'll come up on Eventbrite. I was asked to comment on this Level 2 Understanding Domestic Retrofit qualification that we've recently developed. This is aimed at installers, either existing installers or people interested in becoming installers in this sort of whole house retrofit regime. It's a 3-day course with an examination at the end of it, leads to the award of a NOCN Level 2 award in Understanding Domestic Retrofit. There are 1,000 free places available for that. We've currently filled about 800 of those. You can apply for a place on it via our website and just click on UDR as an application form. But a deadline for applications is coming up very soon. So I'd encourage you to apply for that as soon as you can. We also do a lot of work in the world of social housing. So we work very closely with social housing landlords and local authorities. In fact, we provided consultancy support to the Southeast Energy Hub around the specifications for the programme that you're here today to discuss. So that's if you hear about Osmosis, that's our consultancy arm. So on to PAS 2035. I suppose the best place to start is a fairly sort of macro overview of what's going to change. What can you expect to change? And I obviously don't know who you are and what you currently do. So for some of you, things are going to change very fundamentally. For others, not so much. PAS 2035 is there to introduce to energy efficiency some really key sort of underlying principles. The most commonly used of these, commonly referred to these as the fabric first approach, which put simply is about insulating a building properly, or particularly a home properly, in order to reduce the amount of carbon that leaches through the walls and the amount of heat that's lost through those walls. If we do that first, then we tend to end up in a place where we can have appropriately specified building services and heat systems, and also then renewable energy systems sort of on top of that. So fabric first is often misunderstood as being all about insulation. It's not. What it is about is saying you should address the insulation with appropriate ventilation first, and do the services and do the renewables, usually in that order. So you're working to something of a plan that takes all of those things into account, not just one element of it. This is sort of an extension of it, the term whole house retrofit. It's about assessing a property properly and understanding that home properly, and developing a plan and strategy for that property that addresses all aspects of the fabric, the services, and the renewables. So that's what whole house retrofit is. Underpinning all of that stuff is understanding that building properly in the first place. And there is our old friend, the energy performance certificate. You know, we're not a fan of them, frankly. We're not a fan of the way in which they're developed and the assessments that tend to be carried out in order to lead them, but they're a fact. And PAS 2035 recognises they're not going anywhere. I'd encourage you to be aware that they're a slightly blunt instrument. We tend to use in our consultancy work, we use this thing here. This is something called PHPP, Passive House Planning Package, which as it sounds is something that came out of the passive house world. And it's a much, much more in-depth energy model than RDSAP. And it allows us to build up a very clear picture of a particular property in all its aspects. And the starting place for that in all things is a proper assessment that will take somewhere between half a day and a day to complete, which is a long way away from the existing sort of quick half an hour check. And what we're looking for ultimately are design strategies that are appropriate to that specific dwelling. Sometimes it's an archetype that you can sort of have a variation upon a theme around, particularly in social housing. Here's a sort of a top level strategy we developed for one of our clients on some terrace bungalows. The sort of weighing up, you can see in there, fabric and renewables and services measures. That's very top level, but that's all built off the back of evidence that we can make good use of. And here's another example. So you can see we're dealing there with inbuilt garages, and we're talking about replacing windows and using MVHR and the sort of building envelope improvements too. So we need to be developing retrofit plans for properties, bearing in mind that many people won't have the money initially to carry out all of the things that were on those previous slides in one hit, whether they are a social landlord or an owner-occupier themselves. You know, very few people have the sometimes 50, 60, 70,000 pounds to get all this stuff they want to go. So if we're going to do things, we need to develop a plan which might take 20 to 30 years. It is a route to the optimal retrofit for that home. It's bespoke to that property based on bespoke data gathered through the assessment, leading to stages of retrofit over those 25, 30 years. So we have this target of net zero by 2050. This is how, with this property, we intend to get there. Over a 25 or so year time horizon, it could be shorter, it could be longer. Factoring in trigger points, such as, you know, sometimes these change all the time, but if you're carrying out the assessment and you note that the current occupants are owner-occupiers who are just about to have a baby, they may need to extend, or if they've got children at university age, they're about to fly the nest, then the needs and the triggers are different, and that can all be built into that plan. Sometimes they're just best guesses at this stage. Now, I'm going to try and share with you a very short trailer for something we did called PAS 2035, the movie. There is a link here, which I'll share with you in the chat too, to the full movie, which lasts about half hour. And this is the story of a fictional local authority that sort of was weighing up the pros and cons of using the PAS 2035 approach or sticking to tried and trusted methods.
The story of funding have a meeting faced with the challenge of a generation. Two local authority officers and their contractor have a meeting. At stake, should they adopt PAS 2035 or not? A story of memos, a story of funding regulations and concerns about the cost of compliance. About embracing change and building trust. Will they make the leap in the unknown or stick to what they know? Will they ventilate or prevaricate?
I just can't understand it. We had such high hopes for this lad scheme. We spent £20 million trying to improve people's homes, but the chief exec's inbox is crammed full of letters of complaint. It's going to cost us millions to put right. Treacle is a disaster.
It's a load of red tape. It's optional. I would avoid it like the plague.
But what is it? Just made my head spin. So much jargon. Unintended this, interstitial that, or something. I don't know. And ventilation the other. Load of hot air. They told me I should aim to NFIT with an energy sprung. I mean,
to be honest, I thought it made a lot of sense. Well, I did say that we needed to apply past 2035 at our planning meeting before we started, but you said no.
It's a load of flow charts and processes. It's just too complicated. It's not what energy efficiency is all about, though.
Their fault, we blame them.
Wow.
Guys won't wear it. It's all too academic.
Well, and where does that get us, Bill? And that's the bad habit we've got to wean ourselves off of.
It sounds like he's lost control. We can blame them.
I mean, what's that quote? You know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result, something like that.
Get Sean on here and we'll get to the bottom of it.
As 2035, the movie. It's the biggest film event of the year featuring interstitial condensation.
I think you get the gist. So there's a bit of humour involved in that, and it's a good way of getting your head around it and helping others too, without it being too intense. One of the problems that we face is that we do tend to overcomplicate PAS 2035, and people see it like this is a flow chart. In fact, this is a simplified version of a flow chart, and it can be quite daunting and overwhelming at first. And a British standard, which is like 100 pages of text, not the easiest to read. You know, it's not Dan Brown. So we try and break it down into 6 simple steps. You can see the more complex flow chart here, but we break it down into these 6 steps, and we take our learners and our stakeholders through each of them. Once you get to grips with this, it's actually a very simple process. And for those of you involved in the construction world at the minute, there's nothing complicated about this. It's just different. It's different to what the existing energy efficient industry know. But, you know, we're trying to identify what people want to achieve, and define some outcomes at the start. We're trying to make sure that we've managed the project in an appropriate way through a risk assessment, which is a very simple thing. We're trying to understand that property properly through a dwelling assessment that, you know, gives us details that we need. We're involving planning and design, which often hasn't been the case in retrofit. We're having an installation and handover to the resident phase where, you know, what has been planned and designed is put into practice. And then afterwards, we're monitoring and evaluating that project, usually just through a simple survey process. But crucially, we're not walking away from things that fail until we've resolved them, which is very important for consumer confidence. And we're using this person here. This is our Retrofit Coordinator. We're using this person to ensure that that process is adhered to. And that everything is done as it should be. And those are the people that we train. So the risk management piece is just a simple case of gathering facts about a project. It's in terms of its scale, its complexity, the type of building that we're dealing with, and ensuring that, using my ski slope analogy here, you know, we're using either a green or a blue or a red slope type approach. And we've got people round pegs in round holes doing things for which they are qualified and which they're competent to do. Interesting, the question earlier in the chat about the heating engineer and the retrofit coordinator and how those roles interact. A retrofit coordinator is a jack of all trades, maybe a master of one, but certainly not a heating engineer. And then when we've got round pegs in round holes, it's about ensuring that people are clear about which aspect of a project they can do on which risk pathway. Don't try and take this in now. There's lots of guidance available on our website that helps fill in the detail behind this. Now, there is a really key debate that's going on at the minute about whether a retrofit coordinator should be independent. The PAS says that a retrofit coordinator can work for anybody, as long as any potential conflicts of interest that they may come across are explained clearly to the client, to the homeowner or the landlord. So it's perfectly fine for an installer to have a retrofit coordinator, provided that conflict of interest is declared. And the reason there's a conflict there is that it's also stated in PAS 2035 that the coordinator's job is to be on the side of the client. It's to be their champion. It's to ensure that what is happening to their home is in their best interests and not necessarily the commercial interests of the installer or any other stakeholder. So we tend to find quite a lot of independent domestic energy assessors who become coordinators, and also chartered professionals, such as our architect here. There's a lot of specialists at the heritage end of things and so on and so forth. And increasingly, we're seeing local authorities and social landlords deciding to have their own in-house retrofit coordinators, which we think is a really good model in the world of social housing. That's a whistle stop. I only had 15, 20 minutes to talk to you, and I've been asked to give you 10 minutes to ask questions. But as I mentioned in my presentation earlier, we do put a lot of information and evidence into the public domain. The two articles there, PAS 2035, what is it and what does it mean for you, is the very best place to start. That's an article you can download from our Retrofit Academy homepage, and that explains PAS 2035 in fairly simple terms. And our PAS 2035 compliance process maps are about what a coordinator, an assessor, or a designer, what they must do in order to comply with that standard that they're involved in. That said, there's no substitute for reading the standard itself. British Standard PAS 2035, it actually includes the PAS 2030 standard, which is effectively part of PAS 2035. It's the simplest way of looking at it, just refers to the installation bit. So you can buy that from the BSI bookstore, and we've got a discount code if anyone wants to get half price on that, just let us know. But you must read that standard, and if you're going to work on projects delivered under it, there's really no excuse for not doing that, albeit we can help, as I say, with simplifying and so on and so forth. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll now come back, stop sharing, see if any of you are still there. Oh, there are 29 people here. Okay. So there are questions in the chat here. No one's saying they didn't hear me. That's really encouraging. So I'll take these in order. So BD, Bright, Sam, I think you're probably Sam, are you? PowerPoint presentation will be available via the video, I think. I think there's been a video of this session. That's one to ask the organisers. I'm glad you think it's a great watch. I assume you're talking about the PAS movie. We did have fun writing and producing that. And it's been very effective in terms of getting buy-in from local authorities and social landlords. Yeah, thank you for that. Shalane, I think that is. That's a lovely name, not one I've come across before. As with the focus on air tightness, how does that interact with guidelines on ventilation for COVID risk reduction, particularly on public areas and buildings? So that's a very good question, and it's not really a PAS 2035 specific question, because obviously COVID didn't exist then. The retrofit coordinator's job is to ensure that all appropriate standards, including PAS 2030, especially PAS 2035, are complied with and applied. And we take, you know that, I forget which series it was it Little Britain with the computer says no sketch? We need someone with a brain who's well-trained and educated to be able to not just mean that our national retrofit program is determined by what RDSAP says are the right things to do. And therefore, if we're in an age of global pandemics, which we sadly are, that appropriate measures are installed, particularly in terms of ventilation and fresh air, to ensure that these buildings are future-proofed and fit for purpose. I can't really say any more than that on that, Shalane, but if you want to expand on your question, I'm happy to. Chris Viner, that's a familiar name. I think we know each other, Chris, from somewhere. Do you see the option of having a coordinator within the installer business changing in the future? Right, that's the $1 million question. I see this through two lenses, really. If we could roll the clock back 3 years to when PAS 2035 was being developed, I would without hesitation support having an independent retrofit coordinator, provided the funders were prepared to pay for that service or to ensure that it could be paid for, not leave that white elephant. But they didn't. And it was the PAS, as I said earlier, says as long as the conflict of interest is managed appropriately, that coordinators can work for the installer. And I think it would be extremely damaging if that position was now reversed. Now, I've no reason to think that it will be. I'm only answering your question. I think it's a regular discussion point, but there's an update to PAS due later this year. And what my sources tell me, I'm not actually on the PAS group myself, but what my sources tell me is that that's not on the radar. It's not to say that it may not be revisited in the future. I don't have a crystal ball. But if it does, then, I think the industry needs to be supported, and we need to be keeping things as simple and straightforward as we possibly can at the minute, wherever we can. So hopefully there won't be a backtrack on that. Sonia has asked, how do you think clients will maintain a relationship with RCs over the potentially long term of the whole house retrofit? How will they maintain a relationship? So are you talking about the 30 years there of whole house retrofit that we need to go through on a sort of macro level there, or an individual project? I think if it's an individual project, this needs to be defined really by the individual retrofit coordinator companies that are springing up everywhere. And I'm doing some research for Bays at the minute about how retrofit coordinators work in practice. It's all new. And we need to learn the ins and outs of it. So I'll be sharing results from that at the event on Thursday, or the initial results, but we need to do a very in-depth study of how they're actually operating and what the realities of things are. Our initial, very initial, and it may well change as we get more responses, but our initial findings are that people are managing around about 20 projects at any one time. And projects can range from one-off retrofits, one home, to many. So you've got some people who are operating with quite a light touch, where my question would be, are they doing enough in order to comply with the standard? And then we've got others who perhaps are operating a slightly uneconomic model of dealing with very few properties in great depth, but presumably are offering those clients an amazing service. And maybe they're working with wealthy owner occupiers and they're prepared to pay for that service, whereas that won't always be the case. What we need to make sure we do with schemes like LAD and HUG and ECO and others is that ensure that service there's an appropriate amount of money put aside for it, for an appropriate service, so that customers aren't finding that their retrofit coordinators are disappearing into the sunset as soon as they've been sold something, because that's not what the PAS is about. Hope that answers that question. John Sharp asks, do you see a role for community energy companies in retrofit? I see a role for just about every type of organisation in retrofit. It is the biggest infrastructure challenge we've faced in generations, probably ever. It needs a whole range of different organisations. Community energy companies, if that's quite a broad term, but I think of the ones I know who have very, very strong links into local communities and care about outcomes, are entirely the right kind of organisations to be grabbing hold and taking a lead of that. And I think local action and local community support is a real, it's a great way of building demand. It's also a great way of getting supply chains to give those people what they actually need and the support that they need. So yes, I would hope so, John. Speak to the hub if you're in the Southeast and make sure you get involved. We've got 5 minutes left. I think I've got through the questions. Oh, Linda, the name I know, Linda. I'm thinking you might be from the West Midlands Combined Authority, Linda. I think so. So when purchasing a home that's been retrofitted, how will the buyer know it's been overseen by a competent professional? Will there be a register? So when purchasing a home that's been retrofitted. Right, so there is something called the Trustmark Data Warehouse. Oh, thanks. Okay, there's something called the Trustmark Data Warehouse. I'm Phil Mason is delivering a clinic on this, so you might want to hop into that one next if you want to find out more. So everything to do with a project is lodged in that data warehouse, and that belongs to the property, not to the owner of that current owner of that property. And it will sit there in the in this virtual cloud where you worry about there's actually anything there. But apparently there is. The data warehouse does exist, and everything is being lodged into it at the minute. So that's where the information will be found. The competent professional bit really comes down to whether people have been trained properly and whether people are, whether the accreditation schemes are applying the standards properly and whether the audit regime is effective. We do know, because most of the work that PAS 2035 projects have been delivered so far have been in the eco sector, the energy company obligation sector, which is where the biggest culture change is required, that there are teething troubles. And that whilst people might be qualified, there's fairly clear evidence that they're not all competent at the moment. So it's not an absolute given yet that just because something is in the data warehouse and it might have got through, not been sampled as part of auditing, that those people aren't really competent professionals. But we've got to build those professions from the bottom up. It's all new. It will take a bit of time. And I think, as Phil said, there needs to be a bit of flexibility now, but not so much that we start to get into really bad habits for the long term. The register is the Trustmark website. They have registers of all retrofit coordinators, all retrofit assessors, and the installer companies who are a member of the PAS 2030 accreditation scheme. So there are registers already. I just think there's probably quite a wide variety of organisations and levels of competence within those, which, as I say, we do have some funding at the minute to try and connect good people with good schemes. Okay, I think this might be the final question because we're running out of time. But Andrew Goodin asks, the area I'm struggling with understanding is how best to manage the transition from PAS 2030 2017 to 2019. So if you're not familiar with that, PAS 2030 is a standard. The installer standard's been around for about a decade. Most companies were working from the 2017 edition of that until this year, when they've been upgraded or had to renew to 2019. 2019 version, which is the one that interacts with PAS 2035. So Andrew says, I've had a conflicting advice on this. Would be good to hear your view. Is it possible to complete the voucher scheme and the LAD work under 2017 when we already started those projects? I'm sorry, I can't answer that. The voucher scheme stuff, I believe, yes, you can on most projects operate under the 2017 standard until you are working under the 2019 standard yourself. And at that point, you have no choice but to deliver to the 2019 standard. If that's what you're accredited to, that's what you have to do. I understand there are companies who sort of have ways around that, but that's the dark arts, which I don't understand and I obviously don't advocate. LADs, as it was mentioned earlier, there are a couple of different phases of LAD. And my understanding is that this current round, a big pot of money that's doing the rounds now, LAD 1B, I think it's called, requires compliance with PAS 2035 and therefore PAS 2030 2019. So you're going to need to start operating under those standards, Andrew. But please put your specific questions about the scheme to the Energy Hub because they're responsible for it. Okay, well, we have 2 minutes left. If there are any final questions, I'm happy to answer them. It'd be nice if I could hear you as well as read you, but I better not challenge the technology too much. Whilst you're leaving, I'll mention, how many retrofit coordinators are there at the moment? Right. That's part of the reason we're doing this survey. We know how many we've trained. We're training just on 1,000 at the minute, including 120 who are going for a fast track program, all of whom will be ready by the end of April. We've got 320 qualified now, but they haven't all joined Trustmark schemes for various reasons. And we're trying to understand the reasons behind that. So practicing right now, my guess would be somewhere around 250. That number is going to accelerate quickly because we've got a lot of people getting through the qualification now and a lot more demand for that service. So numbers are increasing pretty quickly. And I think that brings us to 12 o'clock. So I'm due to start this clinic all over again for other people. I politely suggest that you leave and find your next clinic. Thank you for joining me. I've enjoyed your questions.